That is hung up on that ridge. Does not want to come out. Greetings and welcome back. In this episode, we're going to rebuild a 289 that has been sitting in a barn for 57 years. We're going to add some power upgrades, including a solid roller cam, GT40 ported heads, EFI, install a road racing pan from the 60s, and show you how I set up valve springs for the proper installed height. This is my barn find 289. I bought this in Escondido, California about 3 years ago. It was sitting in a barn. But the story is that this came out of a 1967 Mustang. They decided to put in some kind of high-performance engine and pulled this out back in 1967. So if all that's true, there should be some signs that this engine has very little, if any, wear on it. Let's take a look. If we look at the pistons, they look pretty original. I don't see any stampings on them that indicate this is an overbore. In the oil valley here, it says 289. That's a good sign. Let's look at the casting number and see if we can figure out when this was made. This is the date code. I believe it's for 1965. J is for the month, which I believe is October, and 24 would be the date. So October 24, 65 is when this engine was built. At which plant, I do not know. I thought that was what the 4 was for. Somebody said that this is if it's an R or W or C, it'll tell you what plant, but this has a 2-4. So if anybody knows, please leave a note in the comments. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not seeing any really crazy wear in here. So far, so good. I don't know how long the oil's been in this thing. I mean, there's no oil in it now, obviously, but I'm not sure what this other stuff is. And a dead bug. Oh, several dead bugs.
This doesn't happen. You doesn't just come to a meeting and say bugs.
What I'll probably do is I will just gonna take this off and look at the bearing, and then I'll put it back on because I need to stamp all these rods to get them in the right order. Okay, that's what that looks like. I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't think it looks really bad. There's the top bearing. So yeah, it's not looking great. Okay. What am I looking at here? Goodness. So based on what I've seen, this thing needs to go to the machine shop. So while I'm tearing this down, let me tell you where most of the performance parts are going to come from. Over the last 25 years, I've had several small block Ford engines. Each one of those went through various stages of upgrades. And because of those upgrades, I still have usable performance parts that I can use on this engine. First off, although I'd love to use 10 over pistons, they're kind of hard to find and rather expensive. So I decided to go with some 30 over flat top pistons. When I built the Ranchero, I put some pretty good components on it, like disc brakes, power rack and pinion, EFI, and the engine bay. I took off the EFI from Edelbrock, put a carburetor and HEI distributor, and then I used the heads from my Barn Find 289 for this engine. So why did I do that? I took these off the Ranchero because they weren't really getting used with the cam I had in it. These are GT40 heads, and they've been ported quite a bit. So it makes more sense to put them on a high-performance car like that's going to be, rather than the daily driver that it used to be.
I have a plan.
Keeping in mind that this whole build is on a budget, I'm going to reuse an old hydraulic roller cam, some used roller rockers, some solid roller lifters from another engine project, a new set of beehive springs, then somehow make all of this work with my GT40 3-bar heads. Here are the specs on the camshaft I'm using. It's a Crane hydraulic roller cam that I used to have in my first 347. Tools I'm going to be using are this spring pressure gauge, a digital caliper, a motorcycle float level tool in place of a snap gauge, a valve spring compressor which mounts on the cylinder head, some check springs, and a magnetic tool. So what kind of spring pressure do I need with a mild solid roller cam? Generally speaking, we want 165 to 175 pounds when the valve is closed and 340 to 350 pounds when the valve is fully open. So starting with these beehive springs made by Flowtech Induction for the GT40 heads, I'm going to put a spring, a retainer, and the spring pressure gauge in a vise. When it comes to GT40 heads, we're looking for an installed height of 1.800. So by compressing the spring down to 1.800, the gauge shows I'd have 170 pounds with the valve closed. To see what our open pressure is going to be, I'm going to subtract the cam's max lift of 0.526 inches. That leaves us with a spring length of 1.274. And when I squeeze the spring down to 1.274, the gauge shows we have 360 pounds with the valve open. And the last thing I want to do while we have everything in the vise is to check for coil bind. Watch the needle on the gauge. When it jumps, you know that you've gone as far as that spring is willing to go. So to be on the safe side, I'm going to say our coil bind occurs at 1.120. So taking our open height, subtracting our coil bind, we come up with more than twice the clearance that we need. Because without enough clearance, things bind up and bad things happen.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
So now I know that my 1/800 is my target installed height. How do I get there? So let's say this is my spring. And here it is compressed to 1.800 inches. And this is the intake valve stem coming up through the head. Here's the exhaust valve stem, but notice the grooves for the locks are slightly lower. Now let's put on our valve spring, keeping in mind we want to keep that 1/800 installed height no matter where it is on the valve stem. Most of the time this can be achieved by adding different thicknesses of shims and or different offsets of valve locks. The kit I'm installing today comes with these beehive springs on the right with the keeper, special 10-degree locks, which have separate offsets for the intake and the exhaust. So for each and every of 16 valves, this was my process. Put on a check spring, put on the keeper and locks, use my float pole gauge as an impromptu snap gauge, and use it to find out if I need to put any shims beneath my spring to get my installed height. For example, if my caliper read 1/860, then I knew I needed a 60,000th shim to get to 1/800. The shims I was using were 60 thousandths, 30 thousandths, and 15 thousandths. Using a single shim or combination of shims, I was able to get all of my valves within 10,000ths of each other. And here's the oil pan I'm planning to use for this engine. Back in the mid-60s, Carroll Shelby campaigned 65 Mustangs in the B production class for road racing. Some of those cars came with this exact oil pan. Depending on who you talk to, there were either 35 or 36 of the GT350 competition or R model Mustang. Since it was my intent to build a copy of one of those cars, of course, when I found out I could get one of these oil pans, I had to have one. And as luck would have it, when I called, they told me this was the very last one they had on the shelf from the original run for the competition model Mustang. And here are some of the reasons that make these pans so good for road racing. First off, they have a wide sump to hold 6 quarts of oil. There's baffling to control windage, and then there's a box with one-way doors to keep the oil near the oil pump's pickup during hard cornering. So after dialing in and ordering the pushrod length I needed, I went to put on my rocker arms and I saw some things I didn't like about the way they were contacting the valve stem. So I tossed out these fixed guide plates I was using and got an adjustable set. And after a great deal of trial and error, I was able to get the roller tip from the rocker arm sitting squarely on top of the valve stem. And while I still had my check springs on the head, I decided to walk the engine through to check for any kind of valve clearance issues. Now, I could have set up dial indicators with my degree wheel, or put some clay on top of the piston before I put the head on, or I could just walk it through like this. This for me was the easiest way because I'd already crunched all the numbers and I knew there was going to be plenty of clearance. So our little Comet Barn Find 289 is finished. Leave a comment and let me know what kind of horsepower you think it's going to make. So until next time, thanks for watching.